the first thing that unsettles you isn't the blood. It's the silence. Because this story didn't break with screaming sirens or breathless anchors stumbling over words. It arrived the way the most dangerous stories often do, quietly, almost politely. A short alert, a few careful sentences, two names that felt impossible to see together in the same paragraph. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Rob Reiner. Michelle Reiner. Found dead inside their Brentwood home. No spectacle, no flourish, just the kind of pause that makes you stop scrolling and reread the line, because your brain insists you misunderstood it the first time. Rob Reiner doesn't belong in crime alerts. He belongs in memory, in living rooms, in quotes you half remember from films that shaped entire decades. He's a symbol of something stable, familiar, safe, and yet here we were. Two lives ended inside a $13.5 million estate. A son arrested the same night. A family suddenly exposed to the kind of scrutiny no amount of money or legacy can control. At first, the story seemed straightforward, or at least as straightforward as stories like this ever appear in the early hours. A domestic tragedy, a mentally unstable adult child, another cautionary headline that people would read, shake their heads at, and quietly move past. But that version didn't survive very long. Because almost immediately, something didn't sit right. Not with the facts, but with the tone. There were gaps, long ones. There were hesitations in how law enforcement spoke. There were unnamed sources who kept repeating the same phrase in different ways. This wasn't a moment. It was a history. And then, a name surfaced that had nothing to do with police reports or court filings, but everything to do with what may have been known long before anyone called 911. Billy Crystal, not accused, not charged, not even officially quoted, just mentioned, in the careful way people mention someone when they're not sure whether they're allowed to say more. That's when this stopped being a crime story and became something else entirely. Because the question was no longer just who did what on one night in Brentwood. The question became, who knew what, and when? And more importantly, what happens when knowledge is treated like a burden instead of a responsibility? Let's slow this down. Because this story doesn't reward speed, it punishes it. Rob and Michelle Reiner were found inside their home on a Sunday. Reports would later say they had been stabbed, but the details, how, where, how many times, were deliberately scarce. That restraint wasn't accidental. Authorities were cautious, almost guarded. Their son, Nick Reiner, lived on the property. Not inside the main house, but in the guest house. Close enough to be present, far enough to be separate. That detail matters. It will matter later. Nick was arrested that night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. On paper, that sounds decisive. Final, like the system moves swiftly and cleanly. But arrests aren't conclusions. They're starting points. And what came next suggested investigators weren't just looking at a single act of violence. They were looking backward. Way backward. Because soon after the news broke, reports began circulating that the bodies were discovered by the Reiner's daughter, Romy, and that she allegedly told police something chilling. That there was a dangerous family member. Someone who should be a suspect. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a neighbor speculating. This wasn't an outsider guessing. This was a daughter, inside the family, using language that implies familiarity, not shock. Dangerous isn't a word people use lightly when they're still processing grief. Dangerous is a word people use when they've seen something before. And suddenly, the narrative cracked open. Because once you accept that this may not have been an isolated explosion, once you allow for the possibility of a long, buried pattern, everything else shifts. Including the way we talk about Nick. Including the way we talk about Rob. And including the uncomfortable role of those who may have known more than they ever admitted. Here's where the story gets complicated. Over the days that followed, whispers began to circulate, not in tabloids, but in industry circles. Former colleagues, friends of friends, people who had been around the Reiner household long enough to see past the public persona. And the whispers were consistent in one way that mattered. They didn't describe a peaceful home shattered by sudden madness. They described volatility. They described control. They described a dynamic that, depending on who you ask, ranged from deeply unhealthy to outright abusive. Specifically, allegations began to surface that Rob Reiner had physically abused Nick Reiner multiple times over the years. Not rumors shouted into the void, not anonymous internet theories, but claims attributed to people who said they had either witnessed incidents or been told about them directly. Now, let's be very clear. Allegations are not convictions, and nothing about what follows erases the seriousness of the charges Nick faces. But this story cannot be understood if we flatten it into good and evil. Because if those allegations are even partially true, then the timeline shifts in a way that's deeply uncomfortable. It means violence didn't enter that house on one night. It may have lived there, quietly, repeatedly, protected by status and silence. And that brings us back to Billy Crystal. Why him? Why does his name keep appearing at the edges of this story, never in the center, never quoted directly, but never disappearing either? Crystal and Reiner weren't casual acquaintances. They were close, professionally intertwined, personally connected, the kind of friendship built over decades, the kind where you don't just see someone at premieres, but at home, at dinners, in moments that never make headlines. According to multiple sources, Crystal was aware of incidents involving Rob and Nick, aware enough to be concerned, aware enough to allegedly speak about it privately. But awareness is a tricky thing. Knowing something isn't the same as acting on it. Concern isn't the same as intervention. And in Hollywood, proximity to power often blurs those lines until they almost disappear. So here's the contradiction that sits at the heart of this story. And it's one we're going to return to again and again. If someone knew violence was happening, if someone believed a situation was dangerous, if warnings were exchanged quietly, behind closed doors, why didn't anything change? Why did the system, personal, professional, institutional, allow this to continue until the only thing left was a crime scene? This is where restraint matters, because the temptation here is to rush toward conclusions, to assign blame in neat, emotionally satisfying ways. But the truth is messier. Nick Reiner is an adult. He's 32. He's responsible for his actions. That does not vanish simply because his childhood may have been turbulent. At the same time, patterns of abuse do not evaporate simply because the abuser is famous, successful, or beloved. Both things can be true, and often they are. As investigators dig deeper, they aren't just reconstructing a night. They're reconstructing years, conversations, decisions not made, interventions delayed or avoided. They're asking who spoke up, who stayed silent, and who convinced themselves that things weren't that bad. Because here's the uncomfortable reality no one likes to say out loud. Most family tragedies don't come from nowhere. They come from everywhere all at once, built slowly, over time, by moments people chose not to confront because confronting them would have been inconvenient, uncomfortable, or professionally risky. And if that's what happened here, then the story isn't just about the Reiners. It's about a culture that protects legacy over accountability, privacy over prevention, image over intervention. As of now, Billy Crystal has not publicly addressed these allegations. There has been no formal statement confirming or denying what he may have known. And that silence, intentional or not, is part of why this story continues to expand rather than close. Because silence, in a story like this, doesn't calm questions. It multiplies them. What exactly was said behind closed doors? Who else was present? Were there warnings that went unheeded? And if so, why? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if someone had acted sooner, would anyone still be alive? We're going to take this slowly. Not because the story lacks urgency, but because it demands precision. In the next section, we're going inside the house itself. Not to sensationalize it, but to understand it. The physical space, the separation, the proximity that may have made everything feel both contained and inescapable at the same time. Because before there was a crime scene, there was a home. And what happened inside that home may explain everything that came after. What kind of house holds a secret for years, and then gives it up all at once? Not a metaphorical house, a real one. Walls, gates, security cameras. A driveway long enough to create distance without creating escape. Because before this became a case file, before it became a headline or a narrative or a debate, it was a property in Brentwood. Quiet, expensive, designed to keep the outside world out. And in some ways, it succeeded. Until it didn't. The Reiner estate sits in a part of Los Angeles where silence is curated. Streets are wide. Sightlines are controlled. Privacy isn't just expected, it's engineered. Tall hedges, mature trees, gates that don't announce themselves. You could drive past it 100 times and never notice anything unusual. That's the point. Nothing is supposed to happen there. And yet, something did. The layout matters more than people realize. There's the main house. That's where Rob and Michelle lived. The heart of the property, architecturally and symbolically. That's where guests were welcomed, where dinners were hosted, where the version of life that aligned with reputation unfolded. Then there's the guest house. Separate but close. Independent but not free. That's where Nick lived. Not across town. Not in another state. Not even on another street. On the same property. Close enough to hear things. Close enough to feel watched. Close enough that space never quite becomes distance. People unfamiliar with these kinds of estates often imagine ghost houses as privileges. And sometimes they are. But sometimes, there's something else entirely. A way to keep someone near without letting them fully in. Contained. When investigators later reviewed the scene, this separation became one of the most quietly important details in the case. Because it raises questions that don't have comfortable answers. Why did a 32-year-old man live in the guest house of his parents' estate? Was it financial dependence? Control? Family obligation? Or something more complicated? Something emotional? Those questions matter because proximity shapes pressure. And pressure, over time, does things to people. Sources familiar with the property describe it as immaculate, maintained, not cold, exactly, but structured, controlled. A place where appearances were managed carefully. Nothing out of place. Nothing allowed to drift. That kind of environment can feel safe to some people. To others, it can feel suffocating. And here's where the story begins to tilt. Because long before the night of the murders, there were reports, quiet ones, that the home was not as peaceful as it appeared from the outside. Raised voices, tension that lingered, arguments that didn't stay contained in a single room. Not constant chaos, not cinematic explosions, something subtler, more unsettling. The kind of volatility that comes and goes, leaving everyone guessing when it will return. Neighbors didn't report disturbances. Security didn't file complaints. No police were called, at least not officially. That absence becomes its own kind of evidence. Because when nothing is reported, it's tempting to assume nothing happened. But families with power don't operate like ordinary households. Problems are handled internally, quietly, through intermediaries. Through conversations that never become records. And that's where this story lives, in what was never written down. Nick's presence in the guest house was known. It wasn't a secret. But what wasn't known was the emotional reality of that arrangement. Was he there because he wanted to be, or because leaving felt impossible? People close to the family have offered conflicting descriptions. Some paint Nick as troubled, volatile, unpredictable. Others describe him as withdrawn, reactive rather than aggressive. Someone who absorbed pressure until it spilled over. Those two versions aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they often coexist. If allegations of physical abuse are true, and we'll get to those in detail, then the guest house begins to look less like independence and more like containment. A way to keep conflict close, but manageable. A way to keep problems from reaching the outside world. Think about what that does to a person over time. Living on the edge of the family, but never outside it. Never fully included, but never allowed to detach. Every visit, every interaction, every argument. Always within walking distance. That kind of proximity doesn't heal wounds. It aggravates them. And then there's the night itself. Authorities have been careful about releasing specifics, but certain details are consistent across reports. The deaths occurred inside the main house. Not the guest house. Not a shared space. The center. That fact alone has fueled endless speculation. But speculation isn't where this story gets its power. Context is. If violence occurred, it crossed a boundary. Physical, symbolic, emotional, and boundaries, in families like this, are never accidental. When police arrived, the scene wasn't described as chaotic. That's important. There was no indication of forced entry, no signs of a break-in, no evidence of an external threat. This wasn't an intrusion. It was internal. That distinction matters because it reframes the narrative entirely. It shifts the focus away from randomness and toward relationship. And relationships, especially complicated ones, leave traces long before they explode. Investigators began mapping not just the scene, but the history. Who lived where? Who interacted with whom? How often? Under what circumstances? And as they did, they began hearing things that didn't fit the initial, simplified version of events. They heard about arguments that escalated quickly. They heard about moments when tempers crossed lines. They heard about fear. Not dramatic, screaming fear, but the quieter kind that changes how people move through space. That's why Romy's reported statement landed the way it did. When she allegedly told police there was a dangerous family member, it wasn't framed as a guess. It was framed as knowledge. And knowledge implies history. Ask yourself this, and be honest about it. If someone in your family committed an unthinkable act, would your first instinct be to label them dangerous? Or would you be searching for explanations, excuses, ways to soften the truth? The word dangerous doesn't come from denial. It comes from recognition. That's what makes it so unsettling. Because recognition suggests prior awareness, prior concern, prior fear. And that raises a question no one has answered yet. If people were afraid before, why was nothing done? Was it loyalty? Was it denial? Or was it the belief that things could be managed, controlled, the way they always had been? Hollywood families are uniquely positioned to hide dysfunction, not because they're more dysfunctional than anyone else, but because they have the tools to keep problems from becoming public. Lawyers, publicists, private conversations that never leave the room. And in that world, silence isn't neglect. It's strategy. But strategies fail when pressure exceeds control. By the time the night of the murders arrived, whatever system had been holding this family together, however fragile it was, had collapsed. And collapse doesn't happen without warning signs. That's why the physical space matters. The guest house, the proximity, the lack of true separation. Because space shapes behavior. It amplifies tension. It removes the release valve that distance sometimes provides. If Nick had lived miles away, this might be a different story. Or maybe not. That's the uncomfortable part. We don't get to know. What we do know is that when police began reviewing the family's past, they weren't just looking at Nick. They were looking at Rob, at the way authority functioned inside that home, at how conflict was resolved, or not resolved, at who held power, and how it was exercised. And slowly, almost reluctantly, a pattern began to emerge that challenged the image the public thought it knew. Not a monster, not a caricature, something more difficult to confront. A man capable of both warmth and volatility. A household capable of both success and fear. And that's where the story begins to darken. Because once you accept that violence may not have been an anomaly, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who else saw it? Who else stood in that house, felt the tension, noticed the warning signs, and walked away? In the next section, we're going to focus on Nick himself. Not as a headline, not as an accused criminal, but as a person shaped by the environment we've just described. Because before he was arrested, before he was charged, before his name was attached to the worst words imaginable, he was a son living in the shadow of a very powerful father. And what that did to him may be the most important part of this story. Was Nick always the problem, or was he the symptom? That question isn't comfortable. It doesn't fit neatly into headlines or charging documents. But once you stand inside this story long enough, it starts to press against you, quietly, insistently, until you can't ignore it anymore. Because the version of Nick Reiner that most people encountered this week appeared fully formed. 32 years old, arrested, charged, dangerous, according to at least one report. A finished picture. But people aren't finished pictures. They're timelines. And Nick's didn't begin in a police report. It began in a house where power was uneven, where identity was inherited before it was chosen, and where expectations were never negotiable. Nick Reiner grew up with a last name that carried weight long before he understood what that weight meant. Inside the industry, Reiner wasn't just a surname. It was a credential, a shorthand, a signal. Outside the industry, it was something else entirely. A constant comparison. A shadow you couldn't step out of no matter how far you moved within the same property. People who knew Nick at different stages of his life describe him in ways that don't immediately line up. Some say he was intense. Others say withdrawn. Some remember anger. Others remember silence. That inconsistency isn't suspicious. It's human, especially for someone raised in an environment where emotion was rarely allowed to exist on its own terms. Nick wasn't a child growing up in obscurity. He was growing up under scrutiny, not public scrutiny, but internal scrutiny. The kind that doesn't fade when doors close. The kind that teaches you early that your reactions are always being measured. Too much emotion is. And that brings us back, inevitably, to the people who were close enough to see these dynamics long before the rest of the world ever had reason to look. Friends, colleagues, family acquaintances, people who noticed tension at dinners, people who sensed discomfort during visits, people who heard stories secondhand and chose to treat them as private family matters. This is where the story stops being about Nick alone. Because even if he committed the acts he's accused of, and that determination belongs to a court, the conditions that preceded those acts belong to a community, a family system, an industry, a culture that prioritizes discretion over disruption. Nick didn't exist in a vacuum. He existed in a space shaped by authority, silence, and unspoken rules. Rules like, don't embarrass the family, don't air private conflicts, don't challenge the narrative that everything is fine. And for years, that narrative held, until it didn't. The most unsettling thing about Nick Reiner isn't that he may have been capable of violence. It's that people close to the situation may have believed that long before the night, everything collapsed. That belief didn't come from nowhere. And in the next section, we're going to examine the pattern itself, not in abstract terms, but through the allegations that refused to stay buried. Because if there was abuse, it wasn't incidental. It was structural. And once you understand that structure, the story shifts again, away from shock, and towards something far more uncomfortable. What does it mean when abuse is not a moment, but a pattern? That question frames the next stage of this story. Because if Nick Reiner's life was shaped by a series of repeated acts, not isolated incidents, then everything we've seen so far takes on a different weight. The murders, the arrest, the property layout, the quiet warnings, they aren't anomalies. They're the culmination of a system that went unexamined for decades. Sources close to the family, speaking on condition of anonymity, describe repeated episodes of physical discipline inflicted by Rob Reiner on his son. They say it wasn't always overt. A shove here, a grab there, sometimes a slap. Other times, it allegedly escalated to being pinned, struck, or forced into compliance through intimidation. The key word in every account, repetitive. Not once, not twice. Pattern. And that word matters. Pattern implies expectation. It implies predictability. It implies the psychological pressure of living under constant evaluation. Every action, every misstep, weighed against a standard enforced not by conversation, but by physicality. Think about that. Imagine growing up knowing that one wrong move could escalate. That mistakes didn't result in a discussion, but in a confrontation that left both physical and emotional scars. Imagine internalizing fear as a daily companion. That's the environment Nick allegedly grew up in. But it's not a story of Rob Reiner alone. It's a story of a family ecosystem. People who witnessed these moments, family friends, distant relatives, even household staff, reportedly noticed tension and chose silence. Some rationalized it as disciplinary measures, others as private matters best left unspoken. Everyone stepped around the same truth, carefully, delicately, as if saying it aloud would shatter everything. And that silence extended beyond the household. Friends of the Reiners have said that Rob and Michelle maintained a public persona that didn't hint at the chaos inside. The home was welcoming. The family appeared close. Holidays were celebrated, milestones noted, and yet behind closed doors, sources claim, a different narrative unfolded. What happens when those two worlds collide? Public expectation versus private reality? Legacy versus truth? That collision is part of the story's gravity. It isn't just about violence. It's about concealment, about the gap between what people see and what people endure. By establishing the pattern of alleged abuse, we can better understand the pressures that may have shaped Nick. Observers describe him as someone perpetually walking on a tightrope, knowing he could never misstep without consequences, yet never entirely safe in his own home. The psychological imprint of that tension, some experts suggest, is profound. Chronic exposure to authoritative physical control can produce heightened anxiety, defensive aggression, and a readiness for confrontation, all traits that can manifest later in life, sometimes tragically. And then there's the timing. Alleged abuses reportedly occurred over many years, often escalating as Nick aged. What once may have been disciplinary gradually transformed into control. It's one thing to correct a child. It's another to assert dominance over an adult living in close proximity, the guest house on the same estate, ever present, never fully autonomous. We can't know every detail. The Reiner family has maintained near total privacy. Legal documents, if they exist, are sealed. Statements are vague, and yet fragments of accounts converge. Rob's behavior, the household dynamic, Nick's reactions, and the overarching atmosphere of constraint. Now, this isn't to excuse what allegedly happened on the night of the murders. Accountability is still forthcoming, but it does provide context. In an investigative work, context isn't soft. It's critical. Without it, the narrative collapses into oversimplification, a dangerous simplification that erases the systemic factors and reduces human complexity to a single, sensational act. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. What if Nick's actions were the product of a cumulative pressure no one intervened to relieve? What if those closest to him, even those who suspected trouble, assumed it would pass? What if they rationalized the pattern as normal family conflict or discipline when it was something far more corrosive? And now we come to an even more complicated piece, the role of those outside the immediate family, people like Billy Crystal, close to Rob Reiner. Privy, according to whispers, to information that might have prevented escalation. What did he know? When did he know it? And why was nothing done? This is an accusation. It's investigation. Crystal is a figure of enormous public affection, beloved, trusted, someone whose name evokes laughter and warmth. And yet the allegations suggest a private awareness of harm, awareness that, according to some reports, was never transformed into action. Pause and consider that. Someone close enough to observe or hear about abuse, someone in a position to intervene indirectly or advocate for change, allegedly stayed silent. What does that say about responsibility? About the thresholds that define moral versus legal obligation? And it's not just Crystal. According to sources, multiple adults in Nick's life, mentors, friends, family acquaintances, noticed patterns, witnessed tension, or received confessions. Yet almost every account emphasizes restraint. People avoided confrontation, sometimes out of fear of fracturing relationships, sometimes out of disbelief, sometimes because legacy seemed more pressing than well-being. That restraint, that silence, becomes another thread in the narrative, a quiet, almost imperceptible factor that, over years, magnified the pressure, leaving Nick with limited outlets, constrained physically, emotionally, socially, trapped in proximity and expectation, and reportedly punished when boundaries were crossed. And that brings us to the tension between private knowledge and public persona. The Reiner family, like many high-profile families, curated appearances meticulously. Outside the gates, the family was functional, accomplished, respectable. Inside, according to multiple reports, it was volatile. The cognitive dissonance required to navigate those two realities is exhausting. For Nick, this meant living with layers of expectation that weren't negotiable. Every misstep could trigger a response. Every misperception could intensify scrutiny. Every failure to conform was potentially dangerous. And the rules were invisible, shifting according to moods, occasions, and authority. Some psychologists describe this as chronic situational hypervigilance, constantly monitoring one's environment for threats, anticipating consequences, calculating reactions. It's exhausting. It shapes personality. It can distort judgment. And it can have consequences years later when stress peaks and containment fails. And yet, human behavior is not entirely predictable. Context shapes, but does not determine outcomes. This is why Nick's actions are both alarming and, in some ways, understandable. A product of prolonged tension, compounded by inadequate outlets, compounded by perceived isolation, compounded by unacknowledged abuse. It's a cascade, one event layered upon another, over time, until the system fails. And that failure is what investigators encountered in Brentwood. 2 dead adults, a shocked daughter, an arrested son, and a trail of questions no one has fully answered. The pattern we're exploring now, repeated abuse, chronic tension, proximity without autonomy, is critical, because it forces us to see Nick not just as a suspect, but as a human being molded by circumstances, and it forces us to examine the larger ecosystem that allowed the pattern to persist. Family dynamics, cultural silence, the shielding effect of fame, and the absence of intervention. Next, we'll begin to explore the role of Billy Crystal and others in this ecosystem. How does a friend, a colleague, a figure close enough to potentially intervene, reconcile affection with knowledge of harm? What responsibility do bystanders carry? And what consequences arise when concern exists but action does not? Because the story is no longer just about one night. It's about years, decades even, and it's about the people who saw it happen, or who should have seen it, and remained silent. And that's where the story takes a turn that most people outside Hollywood don't fully grasp. Because the pattern of abuse, the tension in the household, the proximity of son and parents, it's not just a family story. It's a story about networks, about relationships that extend beyond the walls of the Brentwood estate, about people who were close to Rob Reiner in ways most of us can't imagine. People who, if they acted differently, might have altered the course of history. Billy Crystal is the most prominent name that surfaces, and when his name comes up, it doesn't do so lightly. Think about the kinds of bonds that men like Reiner and Crystal forge. Decades of shared projects, hours on set, personal dinners, conversations that never leave the room. In Hollywood, some relationships are more than friendship. Their proximity, mentorship, trust, access. Crystal reportedly witnessed, or at least knew about, moments of tension between father and son. He allegedly recognized patterns, and according to whispers from sources close to the family, he discussed these privately. Now pause there. This is an accusation. It isn't suggestion that he's guilty of anything. But consider what it means when someone in that position possesses knowledge of harm and chooses discretion over disclosure. How do you weigh loyalty against responsibility? And what happens when that discretion, however well-intentioned, allows pressure to build unchecked? Sources say that Crystal never reported anything formally. He didn't call authorities. He didn't publicly warn anyone. But the reports suggest that in his private conversations, he acknowledged the troubling dynamics inside the Reiner household. And acknowledgement without action is a concept that doesn't resolve easily. It creates moral tension. It leaves a question mark that hangs over the narrative. What if intervention had happened earlier? While this is unfolding, the dynamics inside the Reiner estate continue to loom large. Investigators have reportedly been meticulous in mapping interactions, timelines, and histories. They aren't only focused on the events of one night. They are digging into years of repeated behavior, into the system that allowed abuse to exist quietly, almost invisibly, behind the facade of normalcy. Nick's role, complex as it is, cannot be understood in isolation. He's living, breathing evidence of years of tension, control, and expectation. And while accountability is ultimately his to bear, understanding the layers that led to the crisis is crucial. What was enforced by a father? What was internalized by a son? What was ignored, rationalized, or silenced by the surrounding network? The night of the murders, by all accounts, was catastrophic. But it wasn't the beginning. It was the apex. The culmination of years of unspoken, unexamined, and potentially avoidable patterns. That's why Romy's reported statement to the police resonates so strongly. Labeling a family member as dangerous implies history. It implies awareness. It implies repeated observations that were never fully addressed. And it's that unaddressed history that brings us back to broader questions about accountability. Not just legal accountability, but moral and social accountability. What is owed by parents to their children? By friends to those they see struggling? By witnesses to knowledge they possess? These questions are rarely easy, and the answers are seldom neat. Because in this story, the boundaries are blurred. Right and wrong exist alongside shades of gray. Loyalty, friendship, and affection are tangled with inaction. Privilege shields behavior from scrutiny until tragedy forces it into the light. Billy Crystal's reported knowledge doesn't solve the mystery. It complicates it, and that's the point. In a story like this, the discomfort of ambiguity is deliberate. It forces you to sit with questions that don't have immediate answers. Questions like, what could have been done? What should have been done? And how much of tragedy is preventable versus inevitable when patterns are allowed to persist? As we continue, we'll explore the specifics of those alleged incidents, the moments that reportedly shaped Nick Reiner over years. We'll look at testimony, accounts from family friends, and insights from people who knew the household intimately, not to sensationalize, but to build understanding of the structure that produced this disaster. Because once you see the system, the network of behavior, expectation, and silence, the night of the murders is no longer just a shocking event. It's a predictable outcome, and that is far more unsettling. We'll also examine how public personas were maintained while private realities diverged sharply. Rob Reiner's legacy, the family's reputation, and Hollywood's culture of discretion all intersect here. The tension between appearance and reality is central to understanding not just what happened, but why. And as we peel back these layers, one thing becomes clear. No single person operates in isolation. Patterns are relational. Violence, whether physical, emotional, or psychological, exists within ecosystems. And in this case, the ecosystem was as star-studded and influential as it was silent. Which brings us to the next chapter, the night itself, the crime scene, and the immediate aftermath. How did authorities interpret what they found? What did they observe about the property, the layout, and the interactions? What questions arose in the first hours that have yet to be fully answered? And how did the presence, or absence, of witnesses affect the unfolding investigation? Because the night of the murders is not a standalone event. It's the apex of a pattern. And understanding that pattern is essential before we attempt to understand the tragedy itself. The night the Reiners died was quiet at first. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of expectation. The sort that makes even well-trained neighbors pause, unsure whether a sound belongs to the ordinary or the ominous. Reports suggest the police arrived after a call from Romy, the daughter, who had discovered her parents and made a statement that would shape the investigation, a warning about a dangerous family member. That call immediately shifted the lens of the investigation. Investigators weren't just looking at a crime scene. They were looking backward, trying to reconstruct years of interactions, patterns, and conflicts that had gone unnoticed or unaddressed. Because in cases like this, context is everything. Inside the main house, authorities reportedly found both Rob and Michelle Reiner stabbed multiple times. The details of the scene remain closely held, but the presence of repeated wounds indicates a violent confrontation rather than a momentary lapse. There were no signs of forced entry, no indications that an outsider was involved. The implication was clear: the perpetrator had access, familiarity, and proximity. That alone reframes the narrative. This was not a random act of violence. It was internal, relational, and, according to preliminary accounts, foreseen, at least in part, by those close to the family. Nick Reiner, living in the guest house on the property, was arrested later that night. By all reports, the arrest was calm, procedural, and carried out without resistance. But the questions surrounding it were anything but simple. How did an adult child, with decades of relationships within the household, reach this breaking point? And what had been accumulating unnoticed, even in plain sight, to allow this level of escalation? Investigators began mapping the household interactions meticulously. They examined the spatial relationships, the separation of the guest house from the main house, the pathways Nick would have had to traverse, and the timing of movements. They looked at communication patterns within the family and across friends and associates who may have observed tensions over the years. Every small detail mattered because it could indicate planning, impulse, or reaction. And in the background of all this, Billy Crystal's reported awareness of household tensions added a layer of moral ambiguity. Sources suggest that he had discussed his concerns privately, aware of episodes of conflict or abuse, but had never intervened formally. The question that arises repeatedly is, at what point does knowledge become obligation? At what point does loyalty to a friend or family connection conflict with moral responsibility? This investigation also revealed the complexity of family dynamics. Accounts describe a mixture of love, expectation, and control that coexisted in the Reiner household. Rob Reiner was reportedly both nurturing and controlling, providing guidance but enforcing discipline in ways that left lasting psychological impact. These contradictions in parenting style, combined with the isolation and proximity of the guest house arrangement, created a pressure cooker environment in which small conflicts could quickly escalate. Neighbors, staff, and family friends all reported subtle signals of tension over the years. raised voices that never became a call to action, signs of withdrawal by Nick that were brushed off as moodiness or normal adolescent behavior, and careful management of appearances that obscured underlying issues. There was no dramatic cinematic moment. There was only the accumulation of small, unaddressed moments that eventually reached a tipping point. Psychologists analyzing similar cases describe the long-term effects of such environments as profound. Chronic stress, hypervigilance, and internalized fear can manifest in ways that make an individual both reactive and defensive. The symptoms often mimic volatility, but their origins are structural rather than spontaneous. In Nick's case, investigators and sources alike emphasize the importance of understanding these patterns before jumping to conclusions about culpability. Consider what this means for an adult living in close proximity. Nick's guest house was a few hundred feet from the main house, a space that was meant to offer independence, but instead became a liminal zone, close enough to absorb tension, far enough to feel isolated. When control is exercised over decades and escape is limited, the environment itself becomes a pressure cooker. Daily interactions, even trivial disagreements, can become high-stakes events in which the memory of past confrontations colors present responses. Psychologists familiar with such environments describe long-term exposure to pattern control as a factor in the development of complex stress responses. Hyperawareness, chronic anxiety, and defensive behaviors are common. Individuals often oscillate between compliance and resistance, caught in a continuous negotiation with authority figures. In Nick's reported case, sources suggest that this oscillation manifested in ways that were observable but often misinterpreted by those around him as volatility rather than conditioned response. Layered over this are the social dynamics. The Reiner family was embedded in Hollywood, where privacy is both cultivated and demanded. Public appearances, professional reputations, and the expectations of colleagues and friends all contributed to a culture of discretion. Family conflicts were rarely aired outside the household. Friends and associates who may have been aware of tensions often rationalized or minimized what they saw, either out of loyalty or discomfort. In such an environment, repeated abuse can continue unnoticed, or at least unchallenged, for years. Billy Crystal's reported awareness adds a further dimension. Close to Rob Reiner professionally and personally, Crystal allegedly knew about incidents involving tension and physical control within the household. According to sources, he discussed his concerns privately, but did not take action that would formally intervene. This creates a moral question. At what point does awareness become responsibility? When does private knowledge demand public action? And when those lines are blurred by friendship, professional bonds, or fear of repercussion, what consequences follow? The night of the murders brings these patterns into sharp relief. Investigators are reported to have treated the crime scene with an understanding of historical context. The acts of violence did not occur in isolation. They were the culmination of dynamics that had been developing for decades: control, proximity, fear, and unaddressed tension. The property itself. The separation between main house and guest house, the circulation of spaces, the physical layout, played a role in both constraining and amplifying these dynamics. Romy's intervention, her report to authorities, disrupted a system that had been self-contained for years. Her awareness, combined with the immediacy of discovery, introduced external scrutiny. Yet even this was not enough to undo decades of entrenched patterns. The systemic pressure, compounded by prolonged exposure to control and abuse, set the stage for escalation. Understanding the structural nature of the alleged abuse helps explain the complexity of the events that followed. It's not about excusing actions or diminishing accountability. It's about context. The environment, patterns, and relational dynamics created conditions that shaped responses. They did not predetermine outcomes, but they informed them. What makes this particularly difficult for the public to grasp is the interplay between private knowledge and public perception. Rob Reiner's public persona was one of warmth, accomplishment, and stability. Behind the gates, sources allege, a different narrative unfolded, one of control, tension, and fear. When the public encounters news of the murders, they see only the immediate shock, the headlines, the arrest. They do not see decades of relational pressure, unspoken rules, or the subtle ways patterns shape behavior over time. This is why investigative nuance is critical. Examining allegations of abuse in isolation risks oversimplification. Context matters. Relationships matter. The environment matters. And understanding these factors is essential for interpreting how the night of tragedy came to pass. The next chapter will examine the psychological and social impact of prolonged exposure to control and abuse, exploring how individuals internalize repeated patterns and how these internalizations can influence behavior in moments of crisis. We will also look at how bystanders, friends, and close associates navigate their awareness of potential harm, and what happens when moral clarity conflicts with social or professional loyalty. Consider what this means for an adult living in close proximity. Nick's guest house was a few hundred feet from the main house, a space that was meant to offer independence, but instead became a liminal zone, close enough to absorb tension, far enough to feel isolated. When control is exercised over decades and escape is limited, the environment itself becomes a pressure cooker. Daily interactions, even trivial disagreements, can become high-stakes events in which the memory of past confrontations colors present responses. Psychologists familiar with such environments describe long-term exposure to pattern control as a factor in the development of complex stress responses. Hyperawareness, chronic anxiety, and defensive behaviors are common. Individuals often oscillate between compliance and resistance, caught in a continuous negotiation with authority figures. In Nick's reported case, sources suggest that this oscillation manifested in ways that were observable but often misinterpreted by those around him as volatility rather than conditioned response. Layered over this are the social dynamics. The Reiner family was embedded in Hollywood, where privacy is both cultivated and demanded. Public appearances, professional reputations, and the expectations of colleagues and friends all contributed to a culture of discretion. Family conflicts were rarely aired outside the household. Friends and associates who may have been aware of tensions often rationalized or minimized what they saw, either out of loyalty or discomfort. In such an environment, repeated abuse can continue unnoticed, or at least unchallenged, for years. Billy Crystal's reported awareness adds a further dimension. Close to Rob Reiner professionally and personally, Crystal allegedly knew about incidents involving tension and physical control within the household. According to sources, he discussed his concerns privately, but did not take action that would formally intervene. This creates a moral question. At what point does awareness become responsibility? When does private knowledge demand public action? And when those lines are blurred by friendship, professional bonds, or fear of repercussion, what consequences follow? The night of the murders brings these patterns into sharp relief. Investigators are reported to have treated the crime scene with an understanding of historical context. The acts of violence did not occur in isolation. They were the culmination of dynamics that had been developing for decades: control, proximity, fear, and unaddressed tension. The property itself. The separation between main house and guest house, the circulation of spaces, the physical layout, played a role in both constraining and amplifying these dynamics. Romy's intervention, her report to authorities, disrupted a system that had been self-contained for years. Her awareness, combined with the immediacy of discovery, introduced external scrutiny. Yet even this was not enough to undo decades of entrenched patterns. The systemic pressure, compounded by prolonged exposure to control and abuse, set the stage for escalation. Understanding the structural nature of the alleged abuse helps explain the complexity of the events that followed. It's not about excusing actions or diminishing accountability. It's about context. The environment, patterns, and relational dynamics created conditions that shaped responses. They did not predetermine outcomes, but they informed them. What makes this particularly difficult for the public to grasp is the interplay between private knowledge and public perception. Rob Reiner's public persona was one of warmth, accomplishment, and stability. Behind the gates, sources allege, a different narrative unfolded, one of control, tension, and fear. When the public encounters news of the murders, they see only the immediate shock, the headlines, the arrest. They do not see decades of relational pressure, unspoken rules, or the subtle ways patterns shape behavior over time. This is why investigative nuance is critical. Examining allegations of abuse in isolation risks oversimplification. Context matters. Relationships matter. The environment matters. And understanding these factors is essential for interpreting how the night of tragedy came to pass. We'll examine the psychological and social impact of prolonged exposure to control and abuse, exploring how individuals internalize repeated patterns and how these internalizations can influence behavior in moments of crisis. We will also look at how bystanders, friends, and close associates navigate their awareness of potential harm, and what happens when moral clarity conflicts with social or professional loyalty. Patterns leave traces. Not always visible ones. Not always reported ones. But they exist, and in Nick Reiner's case, they were reportedly etched into his psyche long before the night of the murders. Psychologists studying long-term exposure to control and physical punishment note that individuals internalize these experiences in ways that fundamentally shape perception and behavior. When a child learns that mistakes will provoke physical correction, they begin to anticipate, calculate, and even preempt responses. Every interaction becomes an assessment. Will this trigger anger? Will I be punished? How can I navigate this safely? Over time, these calculations become reflexive. They form the architecture of daily life, especially when escape is limited. In Nick's case, his living situation in the guest house meant he was never entirely removed from the source of tension. The physical separation from the main house may have provided some autonomy in theory, but it didn't eliminate emotional proximity. According to multiple sources, daily patterns of interaction, small disputes, and minor provocations could carry significant weight because of the history embedded in the household. Small conflicts weren't trivial. They were extensions of accumulated dynamics that had been building for years. Repeated exposure to control can create a dual response: hypervigilance and volatility. Hypervigilance ensures constant monitoring of the environment, anticipating potential threats or triggers. Volatility, in turn, is a defense mechanism, a readiness to react strongly to perceived danger. It is not necessarily inherent aggression, but rather a learned survival response. This is crucial for understanding how past behavior patterns may have shaped Nick's reactions in critical moments. And then there's the moral ecosystem. Awareness of a problem does not guarantee intervention. People close to the Reiners, including prominent figures like Billy Crystal, reportedly had knowledge of household tensions and alleged abuse. Sources indicate that Crystal, though concerned, did not take formal action. This is not a statement of guilt, but of human behavior in social and professional networks where intervention carries risk, discomfort, or perceived disloyalty. In family systems, silence often functions as a stabilizing mechanism until it fails. This failure of intervention extends beyond Crystal. Friends, family acquaintances, and even household staff reportedly noticed tensions over the years. Some rationalized them, others ignored them, and some may have assumed someone else would act. In complex systems, diffusion of responsibility is common. Each person assumes another is responsible, and over time, patterns persist unchallenged. In the Reiner household, according to sources, this may have contributed to the conditions that allowed stress and conflict to escalate to the ultimate tragedy. Consider the psychological implications. Chronic exposure to conflict and control can distort emotional regulation, judgment, and risk assessment. An adult raised in such an environment may perceive threats where others see none, or may react more intensely to stressors than someone without similar conditioning. It is not deterministic, but it is influential. And in the Reiner case, investigators are reportedly considering these factors in evaluating both behavior and potential motive. The property itself, often overlooked in public discussion, plays a role as well. The physical separation between the main house and the guest house may have been designed for convenience or privacy, but it also structured the family's interactions. Proximity without autonomy can intensify pressure, and repeated exposure to tension without relief creates conditions where small conflicts are amplified. Every step from the guest house to the main house carried both literal and symbolic weight, the weight of expectation, history, and potential confrontation. In such environments, patterns of behavior are reinforced both consciously and unconsciously. Adults who experience repeated control may internalize authority in ways that affect social interactions, decision-making, and conflict resolution. The Reiner household, according to sources, had multiple layers of oversight, control, and expectation, not just from Rob, but from the broader social and professional networks surrounding the family. These networks, while protective in some ways, can also insulate harmful patterns from scrutiny. When these dynamics collide with crisis, as they did on the night of the murders, the results can be catastrophic. Investigators reportedly approached the scene with an understanding that what unfolded was not merely a spontaneous act, but a consequence of decades-long patterns. This perspective influences how evidence is interpreted, how behavior is contextualized, and how responsibility is assessed. The psychological analysis is only one component. There is also the moral and social dimension, the question of bystanders. How do friends, colleagues, and even distant family members navigate awareness of potential harm? What is their responsibility, and where does moral duty begin? In the Reiner case, sources suggest that multiple people were aware of tensions, yet formal intervention was absent. Crystal's name arises repeatedly, emblematic of this dilemma. Not a villain, but a participant in a network of awareness without action. A network whose silence may have inadvertently contributed to the escalation of events. These are uncomfortable questions. They resist simple answers, and they are essential for understanding the broader context of tragedy. Because the night of the murders cannot be fully comprehended without recognizing the decades of social, familial, and psychological pressures that preceded it. The next chapter will examine Nick's immediate environment in the days leading up to the incident. Interactions with family members, reports of escalating tension, and accounts of behavior that suggest stressors were intensifying. We will also begin to explore Romy's perspective further, including what she reportedly observed in the household and how her observations may have informed her decisive actions on the night of discovery. The days leading up to the tragedy reveal a subtle but unmistakable escalation in tension. Sources close to the family indicate that interactions between Nick and his parents became increasingly fraught. Small disagreements reportedly sparked disproportionate reactions, and even routine household matters, visits from friends, scheduling, or minor corrections, could trigger episodes of heightened conflict. Observers described the household atmosphere as charged, like a room just before a storm. There were moments of apparent calm, followed by sudden, intense disputes. It wasn't a continuous confrontation, but the intermittent nature of these interactions added to the pressure. Every unresolved conflict, every moment of avoidance or silence, contributed to a sense of cumulative strain. Nick's patterns of behavior reportedly reflected years of conditioning. In the presence of his father, he would oscillate between submission and defiance, internalizing fear while simultaneously testing boundaries. Friends and acquaintances who had contact with him noted a kind of hyper-awareness, a constant assessment of potential triggers. Every comment, every action, seemed loaded with meaning and consequence, a reflection of a lifetime spent navigating an environment where missteps were punished. Romy, meanwhile, observed these dynamics from a perspective of partial distance. Living outside the immediate intensity of daily household interactions, she was able to recognize patterns and assess risk. Her understanding of danger was informed both by what she directly witnessed and by years of indirect observation. Incidents that may have seemed inconsequential to outsiders, but were part of a larger, consistent pattern within the household. Her decision to call authorities on the night of the murders marked a significant break in the family cycle of silence. According to reports, she identified a family member as dangerous, signaling awareness that the tension had escalated beyond private management. This act of intervention, delayed as it may have been, highlights the importance of recognizing danger and acting upon it. But it also underscores the years during which patterns persisted unchecked. Investigators reportedly treated the crime scene with this context in mind. They looked not only at immediate physical evidence, but also at relational dynamics, historical tensions, and behavioral patterns. The investigation extended backward in time, piecing together interactions, observations, and allegations to construct a framework for understanding how the crisis emerged. Every detail mattered. The layout of the estate, the proximity of the guest house to the main house, the chronology of interactions in the days prior, and the psychological environment that shaped responses. Psychologists familiar with family systems characterized by repeated control and abuse emphasize the role of cumulative stress in influencing behavior. Chronic exposure to authoritative physical discipline can produce hypervigilance, anxiety, and reactive tendencies. Individuals in such environments may perceive threats more readily, respond defensively, and experience difficulty regulating emotions. This lens is critical for understanding not only Nick's behavior, but also the broader dynamics that allowed tension to escalate. Another element complicating the picture is the role of bystanders. People like Billy Crystal, reportedly aware of tensions in the household, represent the ethical dilemmas faced by those close to high-profile families. Awareness does not guarantee action, and discretion often conflicts with moral obligation. In this case, sources indicate that knowledge of past incidents existed, yet formal intervention did not occur. The reasons for inaction are complex. Loyalty, fear, social norms, and the shielding effects of reputation all likely played a role. The combination of patterned abuse, environmental pressures, and delayed intervention created conditions that, according to investigators, were ripe for escalation. When long-standing dynamics remain unexamined, they can amplify small conflicts into crises. The Reiner estate, both a physical space and a symbolic representation of family hierarchy, played